Jonestown, the Manson family branch Davidian, all names of cults we associate with horrendous crimes committed by their seemingly brainwashed members. But are all cults disturbing by nature? Are they all capable of such acts?
In light of recent allegations of mistreatment and control by some groups in Australia, we're joined by Raphael Aron, who's the Director of Cult Counselling Australia, to answer all of your questions. Good morning, Raphael. Thanks for coming in. Are cults always religious?
No, they're not. I mean, cults can be religious. The ones in the 60s and the 70s were all known to be religious. We remember lots of processions of people with saffron robes marching up and down Burke Street Mall or Martin Place or wherever it might be. But a cult can be two people. It can be a very, very powerful and influential therapist working, for example, with a very vulnerable patient. It can be lots of different things. It can be a personal development group. It's certainly not just about religion.
Well, what are the common factors then?
Common factors essentially are submission to a leader, submission to a powerful personality, submission to somebody who's got a hell of a lot more influence over that individual than they should, and a hell of a lot more influence than the individual actually wants.
So can you give us do they exist in Australia? Can you give us a classic example of one that might exist in Australia?
They absolutely do exist in Australia. We keep files on probably some 400 organisations which we have concerns about here in Australia. But to give you an example of a cult situation which I was involved in recently, it wasn't really in Australia, but it was an Australian family, travelled to Hong Kong. The woman, who was a very, very good mother and a good person, a career person as well, had three young daughters. In Hong Kong, she got caught up with a particular man who had a rather strange blend of meditation, yoga, and all sorts of alternative therapies. She attached herself to him, I think, in quite an unnatural way. He eventually became unwell and claimed that the only way he could get better was to be able to have a sexual liaison with one of her daughters. Now, you've got a mother who's a perfectly groomed and well-presented, intelligent woman who has brought her children up with morals and standards which are really next to none. And she's now gone to her daughter and said, you've got the opportunity to participate in the highest calling of all times. The daughter eventually had a mental breakdown.
What changes then in someone? What takes someone from being an otherwise upstanding pillar of the community to someone who then falls under the control of someone else?
I think the most powerful element which will explain the phenomena of cults is the desire to belong. There was a social scientist called Konrad Lorenz who once said that the desire to belong is so great, it matters no matter what you belong to, as long as you belong. And this is not true just about cults. There's a lot of research today which is telling us that there are connections between the mind control issues which are raised by cults and the issues of the indoctrination of terrorist organisations. In fact, Alexander Downer, when he was Foreign Minister, and Nick Kelty came up with the idea that there needs to be some deprogramming of terrorists in order to be able to bring them back to a more normal or more normative way of living.
Is there, do the people that follow or typically find themselves drawn to cults, are they typically vulnerable? But the example you just gave us would suggest that they're not.
They're not. And they're not silly. They're not the down and out. They're generally people who are well read. They're people who are doing what every person should be doing in terms of their life. They may be at a vulnerable point in their lives. There may have been breakdown of a relationship. There may have been a financial crisis, the loss of a child, trauma, an accident, some unexpected event in their life. But we're not talking about people who are in any other way incapacitated or in any way having difficulties. They're people who really are living lives to their fullest, and at some point in time that little crack appears and suddenly the vultures jump in.
Is the isolation part of it?
A lot of the cults work in isolation because they tend to create a new group mentality. People who join cults eventually become adopted by the cult as part of the new family, and they leave behind their biological family. And that's really, really scary. It's really scary. I mean, we get calls every day from parents who are not talking to their kids now for years, from parents who haven't seen their kids for years, from parents who may be privileged to receive one card on their birthday, on Mother's Day, perhaps a year, and that's only done as a token gesture, usually at the behest of the organisation, saying, well, just stay in touch with your parents, it's not good for us. So it's really painful.
I'm struggling to understand why these cults are able to control and manipulate their members in such a way. I mean, is something denied of them to keep them there?
I think we all make the big mistake of thinking we're running our lives and we're in control. And that is not the case. You and I could all become members of some sort of a cult at some time. Most people who we pull out of cults will tell us that they never in their wildest dreams thought that they could ever submit to a system like this. Most families that we deal with are absolutely really up in arms about the fact that this has happened, and they are forced to recognize that all of them are vulnerable. And there is, as I said, within us a weakness. There is within us some sort of a frailty. And it's only a question of being able to find that and enter that part of the individual, and you're all theirs. Mm-hmm. So we shouldn't think for a moment this is not relevant to the man in the street.
Okay, so for a family sitting at home, for parents watching who are worried about their children who have become obsessive in a particular area or have met a new group of friends and suddenly it's all about them, how do they know when it takes that dangerous turn?
I think one of the most important issues about cults, and it's one of the things that differentiates cults from religions, is the fact that cults bring about, I suppose, what's been termed personality change. When people stop using their mind, when people lose their sense of humour, when they start looking different, when they start having different ideas about life, things altogether become a major problem. And I think parents sort of need to be vigilant about that. This is not just about taking up another course at uni or doing another course at TAFE. This is about becoming a different person. And I think as parents we're afraid to acknowledge that and afraid to recognise that. We put it down to all sorts of other different types of ideas or different conditions or different syndromes. But the reality is it is an identifiable condition, and it can be seen.